The asteroid belt swallowed us whole, jagged shadows stretching across the void, as my warship threaded impossible paths between tumbling stone giants. The alien dreadnoughts loomed behind me, their hulls bristling with plasma batteries that spat torrents of fire into the darkness. Every blast lit the belt in violent flashes, turning the battlefield into a strobe of death. My hands danced across the controls, rerouting power, shifting vector thrust, forcing the ship into maneuvers no human vessel was ever meant to survive. I cut engines, let inertia carry us, then reignited thrusters at a 90-degree angle, slingshotting around a kilometer-wide asteroid. Their targeting systems lagged, plasma bolts tearing into rock instead of steel. The shockwaves rattled my hull, but I was already gone, slipping into the shadow of another drifting colossus. Their fleet commander must have been furious, hundreds of warships converging, trying to box me in, their formations tightening like a steel net. I pushed the ship into a roll, venting decoy plasma trails that mimicked engine signatures. The aliens fired blindly, their own dreadnoughts colliding as they tried to track me through the chaos. One massive cruiser clipped an asteroid, its shields flaring before collapsing under the impact. The explosion rippled across the belt, fragments scattering like shrapnel into their own lines. I seized the moment, diving straight through the debris cloud, my railguns hammering out a storm of tungsten slugs that punched through their lighter escorts. The tactical AI screamed warnings, but I ignored them, trusting instinct. I knew the belt better than they did. Every rock, every orbit, every gravitational quirk was a weapon waiting to be used. I cut power again, drifting silently as their sensors swept past. Then, with a sudden burst, I accelerated directly into the densest cluster of asteroids, threading gaps barely wider than my hull. Their fleet hesitated, too large, too slow, too cautious. That hesitation was fatal. I pivoted hard, emerging behind their vanguard. Plasma batteries roared from my ship, carving molten scars across their flagship's hull. The dreadnought staggered, shields collapsing in a cascade of energy. I didn't wait to watch it die. I was already moving, already planning the next impossible maneuver, because in this belt, hesitation meant annihilation. And I was the lone human warship, the ghost they could never catch, the predator turning their fleet into prey. Their counterattack came like a tidal wave, plasma arcs converging from every angle, a storm of incandescent fury meant to erase me from existence. I forced the ship into a brutal dive, scraping past the jagged edge of a tumbling asteroid, its surface glowing as plasma fire carved molten scars across the rock. My hull screamed under the stress, shields flickering, but I held the line. I had no choice. One mistake and I was vapor. I rerouted power from life support into the forward batteries, the air thinning in my lungs as the ship's cannon spat a relentless barrage. Tungsten slugs ripped through their formation, shredding frigates that dared to close the gap. The belt amplified the chaos. Every destroyed vessel became a new hazard, fragments ricocheting through the void, tearing into their own fleet. I used it all, every shard of debris, every unpredictable trajectory, turning their numbers into a liability. Their dreadnoughts pressed harder, massive silhouettes blotting out the stars, each one a fortress bristling with weapons. I spun the ship into a corkscrew maneuver, thrusters firing in alternating bursts, weaving through plasma fire so close I could feel the heat radiating through the hull. My tactical AI screamed about shield collapse, but I silenced it. Instinct was my weapon now. I knew the rhythm of their volleys, the hesitation between barrages, the fraction of a second when their targeting arrays recalibrated. That was my opening. I cut engines again, letting the ship drift dead in space. To them, I was a crippled target. They surged forward, eager to finish me. At the last instant, I reignited thrusters, slingshotting around a spinning asteroid and unleashing a full broadside. Plasma batteries roared, carving through their lead dreadnought, its hull splitting open in a cascade of fire. The explosion lit the belt like a second sun, shockwaves scattering their formation into disarray. I didn't pause. I couldn't. I drove straight into the heart of their fleet, threading impossible paths between colliding warships, every maneuver a gamble against annihilation. My railguns hammered, my plasma batteries screamed, and the asteroid belt itself became my ally. They had numbers, they had power, but I had the void, the rocks, the chaos, and the will to survive. One lone human warship, outnumbered 100 to 1, carving through their armada with impossible maneuvers. I was no longer just fighting, I was hunting. And the predators of the galaxy were learning what it meant to be prey. I twisted the ship into a brutal lateral roll, scraping past a wall of plasma fire that would have gutted me in an instant. The asteroid belt was alive with chaos, rocks spinning, fragments colliding, warships detonating in incandescent bursts. Every second was a razor's edge. Their fleet tried to box me in, dreadnoughts forming a kill net, their plasma lances converging to trap me. I refused to be trapped. I cut power to the aft shields, poured everything into forward thrust, and punched through the narrowing gap, hull plating blistering under the heat. Railguns thundered, slugs tearing into their cruisers, ripping open hulls that vented atmosphere and fire into the void. I used their own wreckage as cover, darting behind a collapsing frigate as its reactor went critical. The explosion blinded their sensors for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat I struck. Plasma batteries screamed, carving through the flank of a dreadnought, its armor peeling away like molten skin. The shockwave hurled asteroids into their formation, smashing into ships that had no time to evade. Their numbers became their curse. I felt the ship shudder, alarms shrieking as the starboard shields collapsed. Hull integrity dropped, but I didn't slow. I dove into the densest part of the belt, threading impossible paths between tumbling boulders, forcing their massive warships to hesitate. They couldn't follow me here, not without tearing themselves apart. I was the ghost in the rocks, the predator in the storm. Every maneuver was a blade, every asteroid a weapon. I fired in bursts, never staying still, striking from angles they couldn't predict. One by one, their ships fell, consumed by fire and debris. Their command dreadnought loomed ahead, a fortress bristling with weapons, its plasma batteries charging for a final annihilation strike. I knew I couldn't take it head-on. I cut engines, let the ship drift, hiding in the shadow of a colossal asteroid. The dreadnought advanced, confident, arrogant. At the last instant, I ignited thrusters, slingshotting around the asteroid's curve, railguns and plasma batteries, unleashing everything I had. My barrage tore into its reactor core, and the beast erupted in a cataclysm of fire, fragments scattering across the belt like shrapnel from a dying star. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of my failing systems. The fleet was shattered, their armada reduced to wreckage drifting in the void. One human warship alone had carved through them all. My lungs burned from the thin air, my body trembled from exhaustion, but I held the controls steady. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rewriting the rules of war. The silence didn't last. My sensors flared with new contacts, reinforcements, heavier than before, pouring into the belt like predators scenting blood. Their warships dwarfed mine, titanic dreadnoughts with hulls layered in ablative armor, bristling with plasma turrets that could vaporize asteroids in a single volley. They thought sheer mass would crush me. They were wrong. I rerouted power, bleeding the reactor into maneuvering thrusters, forcing the ship into a spin that threaded me through a storm of incoming fire. Plasma bolts seared past, detonating rock into incandescent fragments that hammered their own shields. I used the chaos, every explosion a curtain, every asteroid a blade. My railguns spat tungsten fury, slugs punching through the seams of their armor, tearing open compartments that vented fire and bodies into the void. Their formations faltered, their kill net unraveling under the weight of their own destruction. One of their dreadnoughts locked onto me, its main batteries charging for a full broadside. I cut power, let inertia carry me, drifting lifeless among the rocks. To them, I was a crippled target. To me, it was the perfect ambush. At the last instant, I reignited engines, slingshotting around a tumbling asteroid, my plasma batteries unleashing a storm that carved into its flank. The dreadnought's reactor went critical, the detonation ripping it apart in a sunburst that blinded half their fleet. I didn't wait. I drove straight into the heart of their formation, weaving through the wreckage, every maneuver a gamble against death. Their cruisers tried to box me in, but I turned their own bulk against them, baiting one into colliding with another, the impact shattering both into drifting carcasses. My ship shuddered under the strain, hull plating scorched, alarms screaming, but I pressed on. I wasn't fighting to survive anymore. I was dismantling their war doctrine, proving that one human warship could outthink an empire. Their flagship loomed ahead, a leviathan bristling with weapons, its command core shielded by layers of armor thicker than any asteroid. It was the brain of their fleet, the anchor of their strategy. I knew if I severed it, the rest would collapse. I cut all non-essential systems, poured everything into weapons and thrust, and dove straight into the storm. Plasma fire raked across my hull, railgun slugs hammered my shields, but I didn't falter. I closed the distance, every second a heartbeat, every maneuver a blade. Then I struck, railguns tearing into its command deck, plasma batteries ripping through its reactor shielding. The Leviathan convulsed, its death cry a cataclysm that shattered the belt around us. The shockwave hurled me into darkness, systems failing, hull integrity bleeding away. But as the debris cleared, I saw what remained. Silence, wreckage, the fleet annihilated. Alone, battered, half-dead, I had carved through them all. My hands trembled on the controls, lungs burning, but I held steady. I wasn't just a survivor. I was the storm that rewrote the laws of war. The silence didn't last. My sensors flickered back to life, painting the void with echoes of movement. Fragments of their fleet still lingered, scattered survivors clawing for cohesion, desperate to avenge the ruin of their flagship. I throttled forward, every vibration through the hull a reminder of how close I was to collapse. My ship was bleeding power, but I still had teeth, and they knew it. A cluster of destroyers broke formation, trying to flank me from 3 vectors. Their plasma lances lit the dark, weaving a net meant to pin me against the asteroids. I cut hard, engines screaming, diving into the debris field where shattered rock spun like blades. Their fire followed, carving molten scars into stone, but I used the chaos, every asteroid a shield, every fragment a weapon. I threaded the gap, railguns roaring, tungsten slugs ripping through the lead destroyer's bridge. It spun out of control, colliding with its wingmate in a burst of fire and twisted hull plating. The survivors panicked, their coordination unraveling. I feigned retreat, dropping power again, drifting like a crippled carcass. They surged forward, hungry for the kill. That was the moment I ignited my thrusters, slingshotting around a massive asteroid, its surface glowing from the heat of their own plasma fire. My ship rolled into firing position, plasma batteries unleashing a storm that tore through their exposed flanks. One after another, their hulls ruptured, venting atmosphere and bodies into the void. But then came the real threat, their carrier, a monstrous silhouette emerging from the wreckage, its hangar bays vomiting swarms of interceptors. Hundreds of them, darting like hornets, their weapons stitching fire across my shields. My system screamed warnings, shields collapsing under the relentless barrage. I dove deeper into the belt, forcing them to follow, their swarm breaking apart as asteroids shredded their formations. I targeted the carrier itself, railguns hammering its launch bays, plasma fire boiling its armor. The swarm faltered, their lifeline severed, and the carrier erupted in a chain reaction that lit the belt like a second sun. The shockwave hurled me sideways, hull integrity dropping to critical. My vision blurred, hands trembling on the controls, but I steadied myself. The void cleared, and what remained was silence. Wreckage drifting, flames dying, the last echoes of their fleet extinguished. Alone, battered, half-dead, I had carved through them all again. My ship was a ruin, but I was still here. One human warship, rewriting the laws of war, proving that empires could bleed. I forced the reactor to cycle, coaxing every last spark of power from its battered core. The asteroid belt was a labyrinth, jagged shadows stretching across the void, and I knew the enemy wasn't finished. Their dreadnoughts loomed at the edge of sensor range, titanic hulls bristling with weapons, each one a fortress designed to crush fleets. Alone, I was a speck against their mass, but speed and precision were mine, and I intended to make them bleed. The first salvo came like a storm, plasma beams wide enough to vaporize entire asteroids. I rolled hard, thrusters flaring, the ship skimming along the surface of a tumbling rock as the beams carved it into molten shards. The dreadnoughts advanced in a wall, their escorts spreading to encircle me. I cut engines, drifted, then reignited in a burst, slingshotting through the debris cloud. Their targeting systems faltered, locked onto phantom echoes bouncing off the asteroids. I used that hesitation, railguns hammering, tungsten rounds punching through the escort frigate's reactor. It erupted, the blast scattering its own formation. They tightened their net, trying to herd me into open space where their sheer firepower would overwhelm. I dove deeper instead, threading the belt's densest cluster, every maneuver a gamble against collision. My hull scraped stone, shields flickered, but I kept moving, weaving through the chaos. Their dreadnoughts struggled to follow, massive frames grinding against asteroids, their escorts shredded by the very terrain they sought to trap me in. I turned their size into weakness, every kilometer of rock a weapon in my hands. Then came the dreadnought's broadside, hundreds of plasma batteries firing in unison, a wall of fire that turned the belt into a furnace. I pushed the ship into a blind dive, reactors screaming, and skimmed beneath the barrage. My plasma cannons answered, concentrated fire hammering into the dreadnought's exposed ventral plating. Armor boiled away, atmosphere vented, and the giant staggered, its guns faltering. I pressed harder, railguns tearing into its spinal mounts until the dreadnought split apart, a leviathan gutted in silence. The others recoiled, their formation breaking, but I didn't relent. I surged forward, every weapon blazing, carving through their escorts, forcing the survivors into retreat. The belt was mine, the wreckage of their fleet drifting in flames, and I remained, scarred, battered, but unbroken. One human warship, outmaneuvering the impossible, proving that even empires could be shattered by precision, fury, and will. The alarm klaxons were still wailing when I cut thrust, drifting sideways to avoid a tumbling chunk of dreadnought debris still glowing cherry red at the edges. My gloves were slick with sweat where I'd gripped the control yoke so hard my knuckles had bleached white, and the taste of iron flooded my mouth from the 9G dive I'd pulled to skim under that last broadside. For half a second I let myself breathe, scanning the sensor feed. 3 escort frigates vaporized, the lead dreadnought split clean in 2, its spinal reactor core still leaking ionized gas that lit up the surrounding asteroids like ghostly lanterns. The rest of their formation was scattering, thrusters burning hot blue as they fled for the belt's edge, exactly what I'd planned. Then the comms crackled, not the fleet-hailing frequency, not the emergency distress channel I'd been broadcasting on loop for 3 hours. It was a tight beam, encrypted, routed through a dead escort frigate's comms array like a needle through a haystack. I flipped the decryption key, and a voice that made my blood run cold came through, flat, metallic, no inflection, the kind of voice that didn't negotiate, only ordered. Vessel designation ASF 7. Surrender your hull and navigation logs and you will be granted a swift death. Refuse, and we will carve this belt apart until every fragment of your ship is spaced across 1,000 light-years. I barked a harsh laugh, flipping the tactical display over. They weren't retreating. They'd lured me into expending half my railgun ammunition, half my shield reserves, strung me along into the densest part of the belt where my long-range sensors were useless. The sensor blips I'd written off as fleeing escorts were turning, their weapons charging, and 3 more dreadnought-sized heat signatures bloomed at the belt's far rim, just out of effective plasma range, hanging back like vultures waiting for the kill. My reactor hummed, a low thrum I could feel through the soles of my boots, even through the cockpit's vibration dampeners. I'd blown their first wave, but they'd brought the whole damn armada. The lead escort that had sent the surrender demand fired first, a spread of plasma torpedoes arcing toward me, their trails painting the void brilliant orange. I didn't dodge. Instead, I yawed hard, lining up my prow directly with the nearest tumbling nickel-iron asteroid twice the size of my ship, and fired a single depleted uranium round from my spinal railgun. The asteroid exploded, a spray of molten rock and shrapnel that caught the torpedoes mid-flight, setting off a chain of detonations that washed out half the escort's forward sensors. The second dreadnought opened fire before the first blast faded, plasma beams wide enough to gut a small moon slamming into the asteroid I'd been hiding behind 10 seconds earlier, vaporizing it entirely. I felt the heat spike through the hull, my portside shields flaring so bright they lit up the cockpit, then dying entirely with a crackle of static. Alarms screamed, hull breach alert, engineering deck 3, minor atmospheric loss, weapons systems at 62% capacity. I didn't have time to patch it. I jammed the throttle forward, skimming the surface of another spinning rock, using its bulk to block the dreadnought's targeting lock, and fired a spread of plasma canisters at the base of the asteroid cluster ahead of me. The canisters burrowed into the rock face, detonated in sequence, and the entire mass shifted, a landslide of stone and ice tumbling straight toward the leading edge of the enemy fleet. The escorts swerved to avoid the falling debris, their formation breaking just enough for me to slip through the gap, railguns hammering. I put 2 rounds straight through the bridge of the frigate that had sent the surrender demand, watched the hull crumple, atmosphere venting in a thin white plume that dissipated instantly in the cold vacuum. The remaining escorts turned to pursue, but I wasn't running this time. I dove for the center of the belt, where the densest cluster of asteroids was, and triggered the last of my experimental ECM charges, small, dense packets of ionized gas that would mess with every targeting system within 10 kilometers, friend or foe. The cloud billowed out behind me, and I heard the enemy comms burst into static over the open frequency I'd hacked into 10 minutes prior. Panicked shouts, orders to hold fire, warnings of incoming debris. They couldn't tell friend from foe, couldn't lock onto anything through the ion cloud. I laughed, loud and sharp in the empty cockpit, and flipped my ship end over end, coming at the second dreadnought from above, its ventral weapons ports completely exposed. My plasma cannons fired in a continuous stream, superheated bolts slamming into the plating until it glowed white, then melted, then ruptured. The dreadnought's own ammunition stores went up, a silent explosion that blew its entire bow off, sending it spinning end over end into a nearby asteroid, where it crumpled like tin foil. The third dreadnought was charging now, its forward plasma cannon glowing so bright it outshone the distant stars. I had maybe 30 seconds before it fired, and my shields were at 28%, my railguns down to 3 rounds left, my hull breach getting worse by the second. I glanced at the tactical display, at the tumbling wreckage of the first dreadnought, its reactor core still leaking that bright blue ion gas. An idea hit me so fast I almost laughed again. I cut my engines, drifted dead in space for 3 full seconds, letting the dreadnought's targeting systems lock right onto my stationary hull, then fired all 3 remaining railgun rounds not at the dreadnought, but at the first dreadnought's leaking reactor core. The rounds punched straight through the already fractured hull, slammed into the unstable reactor, and the entire thing went critical. A wave of superheated ion gas and radiation burst out, expanding faster than any weapon fire, and the charging dreadnought took it full in the face. Its forward shield shattered instantly, its hull glowed orange under the radiation, then its own reactor overloaded, blowing apart in a flash so bright it lit up the entire asteroid belt for 10 full seconds. The remaining escorts turned tail and ran, no feint this time, no retreating to the rim to regroup. They were fleeing, burning every ounce of thrust they had, and I didn't chase them. I sat there for a minute longer, watching the last of their engine trails fade into the dark, the klaxons finally quieting down to a low, steady hum. My hull was scarred, my port side had a gash big enough to fit a ground car through, My reactor was running at 110% and threatening to blow if I didn't throttle it back, but I was still here. I flipped the comms to the fleet's open frequency, keyed the mic and said, soft enough that only they could hear, ASF-7 to Fleet Command. Belt is secure, send cleanup crews and send a tow. I'm gonna need a new hull. Then I leaned back in the pilot's seat, let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 3 hours, and watched the stars spin slow through the cracked cockpit glass. The belt was quiet now, save for the soft pop of venting atmosphere from the wreckage drifting past, and for the first time since the alarm had first screamed 3 days prior, I didn't have to watch my back. Not yet, anyway. I throttled the reactor back down to 70%, just enough to keep the ship alive without risking another overload. The asteroid belt was littered with wreckage now, twisted hulls drifting silently, glowing fragments tumbling like embers in the void. My sensors pinged faint signatures. Those escorts hadn't gone far. They were regrouping, pulling in reinforcements, and I knew this wasn't over. The fleet would send more, heavier ships, maybe carriers this time. They'd want revenge for losing 3 dreadnoughts to a single human warship. I rerouted power from the damaged port thrusters into the starboard railgun capacitors, forcing the system into a configuration no engineer would ever approve. The tactical display flickered, showing me the asteroid field ahead, dense clusters of rock, some kilometers wide, others no bigger than a fighter craft. Perfect cover if I played it right. I pushed the ship forward, weaving between the jagged masses, letting the belt swallow me whole. The escorts would have to chase me in here, and their bulk made them clumsy. My ship was scarred, bleeding atmosphere, but it was still nimble enough to dance. The first wave came fast, 6 cruisers, their plasma batteries lighting up the dark like miniature suns. I cut engines again, let inertia carry me, then fired a burst from the starboard railgun. The shot ricocheted off an asteroid's iron core, splitting into fragments that peppered the lead cruiser's shields. They flared, overloaded, and the cruiser spun sideways, colliding with another. The impact tore both ships open, venting fire and crew into the void. I didn't wait to admire it. I dove deeper, scraping hull against rock, sparks trailing behind me. Their plasma fire followed, carving molten scars into the asteroids, detonating pockets of frozen gas that went off like mines. I used the chaos, slingshotting around a tumbling boulder, then cut across their formation. My railgun spat another round, this time into the aft engines of a cruiser trying to flank me. The shot punched through, igniting its reactor. The explosion was so violent it shattered 3 nearby asteroids, sending shards spinning like blades through the fleet. One shard impaled a frigate clean through its bridge, silencing its guns instantly. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, louder than the klaxons. Every maneuver was a gamble, every shot a prayer, but the belt was mine. I knew its currents, its shadows, its traps. They were outsiders here, lumbering beasts trying to hunt a predator they couldn't see. I twisted the ship again, scraping past another asteroid, and whispered to myself, "Come on then. Let's finish this." A low, subsonic thrum vibrated through the deck plates before my long-range sensors even pinged the signatures. Deep green icons blooming across the tactical display like rot spreading across glass. 2 Kael'th dreadnoughts, 12 kilometers of jagged, obsidian-hulled war machine, cresting the outer edge of the belt, their forward plasma batteries glowing so bright they washed out the sensor feed for 3 full seconds. The first salvo screamed across the void before they'd even cleared the outermost asteroid clusters, bolts of viridian plasma melting through basalt and iron like the rock was wet ice, vaporizing a 400-meter-wide spire less than a click ahead of me in a flash of incandescent white. My forward shields flared and collapsed under the glancing hit, sparks showering across the cockpit as I yanked the control stick hard to port, straining the already ruptured port thruster housing until I heard the familiar, sickening scream of tearing metal. The hull scraped hard enough against the jagged edge of the spire to leave a 20-meter gash in the starboard armor, but the maneuver pulled me out of the path of the follow-up shot that would have turned my bridge into superheated plasma. The bolt slammed into the rock I just vacated, blowing it into a cloud of tumbling gravel that peppered the hull like shrapnel, pinging off the reinforced plating and setting off half a dozen proximity alarms. The 4 surviving cruisers from the first wave were already angling to cut off my retreat deeper into the belt, their aft batteries tracking my movement, plasma bolts stitching a line of molten craters across the rock behind me. I kicked the damaged port thrusters to maximum override, ignoring the screaming hull integrity alarms, and slingshotted myself around the far side of a 3-kilometer-wide nickel iron asteroid just as the lead dreadnought's main cannon fired. The plasma bolt slammed into the asteroid's near face, vaporizing 500 meters of solid rock in a split second, the shockwave sending a shower of tumbling boulders spinning out in all directions. One of the half-kilometer-wide shards slammed straight into the bow of the lead cruiser, crumpling its armor like tin foil and detonating its forward plasma magazine inside its own hull. The cruiser blew apart in a silent, expanding fireball that lit up the shadow of the asteroid for half a second, debris peppering the second dreadnought's forward shields hard enough to make it veer hard to starboard. The second dreadnought corrected its course immediately, laying down a wide, sweeping barrage of plasma across the entire width of the belt, chewing through asteroid after asteroid, melting frozen methane pockets that went off like chain mines, orange fireballs blooming and drifting slowly through the void. I dove into a dense cluster of porous carbonaceous rocks, their soft, crumbly surfaces absorbing the stray plasma shots that pinged off my hull, and watched as the dreadnought's fire vaporized 3 of the asteroids I'd been hiding behind 10 seconds earlier. My railgun capacitors finally finished charging after the power reroute, and I popped out from behind a 100-meter-wide rock, firing a single, high-velocity round directly into the dreadnought's forward sensor array. The round punched through the 2-meter-thick armored housing and exploded inside the sensor suite, blinding the entire forward section of the ship. The dreadnought veered wildly, slamming hard into the second cruiser that had been trying to pin me, both ships tumbling out of control, their plasma cannons firing wildly into empty space. One stray bolt sliced clean through the wing of a frigate that had slipped in behind me, turning it into molten slag before it could even get a targeting lock. A chorus of high-pitched whines cut through the klaxons a second later, and 12 Kael'th fighters poured out of the dreadnought's still intact hangar bay, tiny specks zipping through the gaps in the asteroid field, their nose cannons spitting tiny plasma bolts that pinged harmlessly off my rear shields. I didn't bother evading. Instead, I dove headfirst into a narrow crevice between 2 tumbling asteroids, only 50 meters wide at its narrowest point, too tight for the fighters to follow, too shallow for the dreadnought's cannons to angle down to hit me. I could hear the fighters buzzing outside the crevice, their sensor pings echoing off the rock, but they couldn't get a lock, couldn't angle their cannons through the gap. My auxiliary power reserves were sitting at 4%, hull integrity at 17%, and the cockpit was losing pressure fast, the oxygen alarm blaring so loud in my ear it was drowning out the hum of the engines. I didn't have time to waste. I rerouted every last joule of power to the railgun, aimed not at the dreadnought, but at the overhanging 2-kilometer-wide basalt spire perched directly above the crevice. I fired. The round slammed into the spire's weakest point, shearing it clean off. The massive chunk of rock came crashing down directly onto the dreadnought's flight deck, crushing 8 of the 12 fighters before they could return to the hangar, crumpling the bay doors and trapping the remaining 4 inside. The dreadnought lurched, its reactor spiking so hard on the thermal sensors it looked like a second sun, and I could see the crew panicking as they vented atmosphere to put out fires, their formation completely broken. The 2 remaining cruisers broke formation immediately, thrusting hard back toward the edge of the belt, trying to flee before I could target them. I popped out of the crevice, my railgun capacitors sparking as I drained the last of their charge, and fired a single, final round straight into the lead cruiser's aft engine assembly. The round punched through the reactor casing, and the cruiser detonated so bright it temporarily blinded all my forward sensors. When the feed cleared a second later, the only signatures left in the belt were my own, and the faint, fading heat blooms of the surviving Kael'th ships retreating out into deep space. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the control stick, sweat stinging my eyes inside my helmet, the ship's AI chirping a steady stream of warnings I barely registered. The hull was bleeding atmosphere. The starboard railgun was fused solid. Half the cockpit displays were dark, but I was still here. The fleet was gone. I'd outmaneuvered them, used their own weight and arrogance against them, turned the belt they'd come to hunt me into their graveyard. I keyed the comms, my voice rough, half drowned out by the crackle of static. "Command, this is Vanguard. The Kael'th incursion force is neutralized. Repeat, incursion force neutralized. Casualties on their end, 3 dreadnoughts, 5 cruisers, 1 frigate, 12 fighters. Casualties on my end. A really bad scratch and a very angry engineer who's gonna yell at me for rerouting power to the railguns." A faint laugh crackled back over the line, followed by the sound of cheering I could barely hear through the hull breach. I leaned back in my command chair, watching the tumbling, glowing fragments of the destroyed fleet drift like embers through the asteroid field, and smiled. Belt was mine. It always had been. The asteroid belt was silent again, but silence in war is never permanent. My sensors caught the faint ripple of gravitic distortion at the belt's edge, Kael'th reinforcements, heavier than the last wave. Their dreadnoughts emerged like obsidian leviathans, hulls bristling with plasma turrets, each one capable of vaporizing a city block in a single volley. I tightened my grip on the controls, every nerve screaming at me to run, but retreat wasn't an option. This was my battlefield, and I knew every rock, every shadow, every blind spot the belt could offer. The first salvo came in hard, plasma bolts streaking across the void, carving molten scars into the asteroids around me. I rolled the Vanguard into a narrow fissure, thrusters screaming as I skimmed the rock face so close the hull plating sparked from the friction. Their targeting arrays struggled to lock me, the belt's density scattering their sensor returns. I fired a burst from the port railgun, the shot ricocheting off a fragment of iron-rich stone and slamming into the flank of a cruiser. The detonation tore half its hull away, sending it spinning into the belt like a crippled beast. The dreadnoughts adjusted, spreading into a wide net, trying to box me in. I rerouted power from life support into maneuvering thrusters, the cockpit temperature climbing past survivable limits, sweat boiling against my skin. I dove deeper, threading through a labyrinth of tumbling debris, forcing them to follow. Their plasma fire lit the belt like a storm, but every shot that missed carved new hazards into their path. One dreadnought clipped a drifting boulder, its shields flaring, and I seized the moment, launching a spread of kinetic penetrators straight into its exposed ventral plating. The rounds punched through, igniting its reactor. The ship bloomed into a fireball, fragments scattering like shrapnel across the belt. The remaining ships pressed harder, their formation tightening, their captains desperate to crush me before I could bleed them further. I cut power, letting Vanguard drift cold and silent, hidden among the wreckage. Their sensors swept past, blind to the ghost in the rocks. When the lead dreadnought drifted into range, I reignited the engines, railguns roaring as I unleashed a full barrage into its command tower. The structure crumpled, atmosphere venting in a violent plume, and the dreadnought staggered, its guns falling silent. The belt was chaos now, Kael'th ships colliding with debris, plasma fire ricocheting wildly, their fleet unraveling in the storm they'd unleashed. I moved like a shadow, striking from angles they couldn't predict, every maneuver impossible by their standards, every kill a reminder that one human warship could turn their armada into wreckage. My hull was cracked, my systems failing, but I was still here, and as long as I was, the belt would remain a graveyard for anyone foolish enough to challenge me. I slammed the throttle forward, the Vanguard's engines howling as I burst from cover, streaking through the chaos like a phantom. Plasma lances crisscrossed the void, each one a sun-bright death beam that could vaporize me in an instant. I twisted hard, rolling the ship into a corkscrew maneuver that dragged their targeting solutions into failure. Their dreadnoughts were massive, kilometers of armored hull bristling with turrets, but their sheer size was their weakness. In the belt, agility was survival, and I was the only predator fast enough to thrive. A destroyer broke formation, trying to flank me. I cut power to the starboard thrusters, letting the Vanguard drift sideways, presenting a false vector. The destroyer committed, its guns blazing, but I reignited the engines at full burn, slingshotting around a spinning asteroid. My railgun spat tungsten fury, the rounds tearing through its bridge in a heartbeat. The ship convulsed, its reactor spilling plasma into the void before it disintegrated in a silent explosion. The dreadnoughts responded with saturation fire, plasma storms sweeping entire sectors of the belt. Asteroids shattered, fragments cascading like a rain of knives. I dove into the maelstrom, shields flaring, hull screaming under the impacts. Every maneuver was a gamble, every second a razor's edge between brilliance and annihilation. I threaded through a collapsing asteroid, the Vanguard scraping through a tunnel of molten rock as the dreadnought's fire consumed it behind me. I emerged into their blind arc, railguns already locked. My salvo ripped into the aft engines of their flagship, the colossal vessel lurching as its propulsion died. It drifted helplessly, a Titan brought low by a single strike. Their fleet was unraveling, cohesion lost, captains panicked. I could feel their desperation in the way their fire grew erratic, their formations collapsing into chaos. I used it, darting between wreckage, striking like a phantom. Every kill was precise, every maneuver impossible, every moment a reminder that the belt was mine. My systems were failing, alarms screaming in my ears, but I refused to yield. I was the lone human warship, the shadow in the rocks, and tonight the Kael'th fleet would learn that even an armada could bleed. I pulled the Vanguard into a brutal pitch, the inertial dampeners shrieking as the ship clawed through the debris field. Shards of iron and nickel slammed against the shields, each impact a thunderclap in the void. The Kael'th frigates surged forward, their formation tightening, desperate to box me in. I could see their intent, herd me into a kill zone, saturate the belt with plasma until nothing remained. They thought brute force could cage me. They were wrong. I cut main power for a heartbeat, plunging the Vanguard into darkness. Their sensors lost me, their targeting arrays scrambling to reacquire. In that silence I drifted, a ghost among shattered worlds. Then I reignited the drives, a sudden flare that sent me rocketing perpendicular to their kill box. Their plasma storm erupted where I should have been, carving asteroids into molten rivers, but I was already behind them. My railguns thundered, tungsten slugs ripping into the stern of a cruiser. Its hull split open, atmosphere venting in a geyser of frozen mist before the reactor went critical. The explosion tore through their formation, scattering ships like leaves in a gale. The dreadnoughts lumbered to pivot, their turrets vomiting fire in every direction. I dove beneath their firing arcs, hugging the jagged surface of a tumbling asteroid. The Vanguard scraped so close I could feel the hull vibrating from the rock's magnetic field. I launched a spread of smart torpedoes, each one weaving through the chaos like predators scenting blood. They struck in unison, detonating along the dreadnought's port side. Armor peeled away, decks collapsed, and the giant listed, bleeding plasma into the void. The Kael'th fleet was unraveling faster now, their discipline shattered. Fighters swarmed, hundreds of them, a storm of gnats armed with plasma stingers. I rolled the Vanguard into a spiral, railguns and point defense cannons blazing, carving swaths through their ranks. Explosions blossomed around me, each kill a brief star born in the abyss. My shields flickered, systems screamed, but I pressed harder, every maneuver a defiance of physics, every strike a declaration that one ship could break an empire. I could feel the tide shifting. Their dreadnoughts were crippled, their cruisers burning, their fighters dying in droves. The asteroid belt was no longer their battlefield. It was my hunting ground, my domain. I was the lone human warship, bleeding but unbroken, and the Kael'th would remember this night as the moment their armada was shattered by a single predator who refused to die.